Hey everyone, it's the Procrastinating Professor, and today we're going to be talking about painting Tyranids. So this Tyranid scheme that you see before you is a little bit of a variant of the Hivefleet Leviathan, painted in these colors because originally when I came up with this color scheme, it was for a gift to a loved one, and this loved one preferred this kind of pinkish violet color, and I figured that blue will also kind of complement it. So yeah, I'm painting it in this scheme. So with that said, let's start with the primer first as usual. So in this case today I'm using German red brown. It has this kind of nice reddish undercoat. You don't have to really start with this undercoat. Very frankly, you could have started with a grey, could have started with a white, but I chose this simply because I think it helps add some color. Now, with that said, I am going to move on to actually kind of doing an undershade with Thornwood green. So undershading is a lot like zenithal highlighting. Zenithal highlighting, of course, we usually come from the top, but in this case, as you can see from the video, I'm coming from the bottom. So typically speaking, you will want to only do this at an angle from the bottom, but I realized halfway through my painting that I was worried that the final end model is going to look a little bit too red. So I also made the decision to actually spray it kind of at a horizontal 90-degree angle as well, covering, well, about 75% of the model with this kind of Thornwood green and leaving the reds for the top as well as kind of the recesses. So you kind of see me just spraying the model very liberally. Theoretically speaking, you could have started by just simply undercoating this entire model with Thornwood green instead of red brown, but I figured that I kind of wanted to have a nice primer for these models. The tails, especially for Tyranids and all of these talons and whatnot, they scrape around quite a bit when you're playing with them, so I just wanted to make sure that I had a nice primer in place before I continued my paint job. So there you go. And later on, of course, we are going to be building on the lighter colors and as well as the darker colors to improve the contrast. So for now, let's start with the lighter colors first. All of this is being accomplished with airbrush using mahogany brown. So in this case, I am now using a zenithal. And I realized during the review of the video that actually from the video perspective, mahogany brown is only very slightly brighter than red brown. I'm pointing this out because even though I did it this way, theoretically speaking, you could possibly completely skip this step if you wanted to save some time. You know, if you were painting, let's say for example, 200 gons, then maybe perhaps you could skip mahogany brown entirely. You could even potentially skip the next step, which is the next highlight. Depends on how nice and how smooth you want your transitions to be. But whatever the case, I decided to go with mahogany, and I'm going to keep doing that for my own models moving forward. So again, it's a zenithal highlight, focusing on the areas that I wanted to be brighter, making sure not to accidentally cover the areas that I sprayed with the Thornwood green previously. Now building up a little bit of a highlight using a 50-50 mix of mahogany as well as pale flesh. And again, I am kind of focusing on the areas that will catch the light. So the faces, the top parts of the ribs, anything that basically protrudes out that will catch the light. And in the case of Tyranid models, of course, they have a lot of texture. So airbrushing really does wonders in this case. And of course, when we are dealing with this kind of light fleshy colors, as I mentioned in one of my previous videos, they tend to be fairly translucent, so you may actually want to do several layers to kind of make sure everything is smoothly blended. And again, it's also very important to not cover the entire model with this from the top. I used to do that as a novice mistake when I started airbrushing, where I thought that, oh, I would just point my airbrush at 75 degrees and just pull the trigger that cover the entire top of the model. But that doesn't give very good contrast. So again, purposely leaving the Thornwood green showing underneath, also making sure that I leave a little bit of that red brown showing underneath as well. So again, just building up a few extra layers. I think I did at least 2 or 3 layers of this overall. And then now I'm following this up with pale flesh. Straight pale flesh, and again focusing on the same areas, but of course keeping it a little bit narrower than in the past. Now pale flesh is extremely translucent, especially when thinned down. So when you're looking at this video, of course you can kind of see the pale flesh kind of showing through, but I realized later in the painting process that my pale flesh wasn't pale enough. Ultimately, I was hoping to get to this kind of whitish kind of end color. So even though I did not video it, I actually went over the model one more time with pale flesh later on after I had painted the talons and the carapace as well. So spray it all on. Now again, this is because I really want it really bright. If you don't want it so bright, it's totally fine. You don't need to go so many layers with pale flesh. I think at the end of the day, I went with about 2 layers at this stage, as well as a third layer of pale flesh later on, as I mentioned earlier. So again, just focusing on the areas that will catch the light, making sure to leave, of course, all the previous colors showing underneath for some variation, some modulation in the coloration. You also notice I'm not really bothering to spray, for example, the armor panels because I'll be painting those entirely differently. Some people may think to yourselves, hey prof, why don't you just Zenithal highlight the armor plates while you're at it? Well, Zenithal under highlighting, I guess, doesn't really work very well for certain colors, especially very opaque colors. And we're going to be working with purples later on, so I felt that there's not much point in doing that. So save some time, save some paint, and just focus on the white areas for now. So highlighting, just moving around, highlighting everything. Now, one of the problems with this kind of style of painting is, of course, the fact that you're going to have a lot of this red and this brown and this white. It kind of sort of starts to look organic, but it's a little bit lacking something. As I mentioned previously, you kind of want either greens and or reds and or purples to make things look a little bit more realistic. So in this case, I'm using Nurgling Green, and the area that I'm spraying with the Nurgling Green would be the areas that I kind of feel need a little bit of transition. So a transition between the red browns, the Thornwood greens, as well as the pale flesh. So I'm just kind of covering up the areas which were a little bit too dark, too unnatural. The last thing you want is for white, the kind of white flesh, I guess, the white carapace parts of the Tyranids to look like alabaster or porcelain, and that doesn't look very convincing as far as a biological organism goes. So a little bit of green here and there, as you kind of see, is adding a little bit more color as well to the model, which of course more color makes it look hopefully a little bit more vibrant at the end of the day. So all the transition areas, wherever your eyes, or in my case my eyes, where I caught that the transition was a little bit too stark between the red brown and the pale flesh, I kind of sprayed over with Nurgling Green. Of course, later on we'll be going through with a brush to further increase the contrast, so don't worry about it looking a little bit splotchy and messy. At this stage, it's totally fine. So there you go, that's basically the white flesh for now. Now let's move on to the talons and the claws and whatnot. In this case, I'm just using Screamer Pink and just covering it all up with a brush. You could theoretically airbrush all of this, but I didn't want to mask the model. You'll notice that in this case, I'm actually purposely painting it without any sort of masking, without any sort of sub-assemblies, because when you're painting for an army, as I am in this case, I'm not painting this as a display. All those steps actually kind of add time if you're not careful, but it really depends. If you think that helps, then go right ahead. Now using Pink Horror, which is a lighter pink, I just painted the mouth parts, the tongue, and I also painted the lips as well. Now finally, we're working on the carapace. I'm going over the carapace with Royal Purple using a brush. Again, as I mentioned just now, if you wanted to, you could totally mask this model, but imagine masking the entire carapace. It's going to probably take far more time than just painting this with a brush. So I decided, I'll just paint it with a brush. And because the color is extremely opaque, it goes over in a single layer. Now, keeping with this theme of purple, I'm going to use Druchii Violet on all the red parts, as well as the mouth. Very importantly, I'm actually not using this on the armor plates. I will be highlighting and shading them separately later. So yeah, just the talons, just the claws, just the feet, and the mouth. Also on top of that, I also used the Druchii Violet to shade in all of the different joints. So again, this is adding a little bit more purple to the model, to the fleshier parts. So as you can kind of see, I'm just letting it flow into the crevices and the cracks. It gives a lot of contrast immediately, which is very nice. And it adds that kind of purplish tinge to complement the whites and the greens to hopefully make it look a little bit more like a living thing. Now, using a 50-50 mix of Bright Angel's contrast paint as well as satin varnish, I paint the rest of the weapon. So for this weapon, instead of starting it with the same colors as I did the claws, I figured that I'll make it very slightly redder. At the end of the day, in the final product, it looks fairly similar, but there is a very mild difference between the claws and the weapon. Now, using Vallejo Pink, I'm airbrushing the highlights. Again, I'm primarily focusing on the areas that will catch the light. And as per usual, because I'm painting this for an army, I am not going to spend all the time like kind of making sure that my airbrush game is perfect. No, just focus on where you think the light will catch. So all of these areas in between, you can kind of see me building up the shades. And again, don't just point the airbrush from the top and just pull it back and cover the entire top with the pink. You kind of want to leave areas intentionally in the royal purple. Now, when I did this originally, I realized that it kind of lost a little bit of its purpleness, and coming back to the fact that this was meant to be a present, the original scheme at the very least was meant to be a gift to a loved one, and that loved one wanted something that's a little bit more pinkish and purplish, I figured that, well, I needed to kind of blend it all in together. So you can see down here, if I stop down here with just the pink, actually it'll make a pretty good Leviathan color scheme. I think you can just stop here and don't push it any more pink than this. But because I wanted to make it a little bit more pinkish purple, I added one more step in between. So the next step is going to be basically warlock purple. And I'm going to be using this to transition between the royal purple parts, which are the really dark and rich purple, as well as the brightly colored pink highlighted areas. This is the dominant color that kind of pushes the model away from the basic Leviathan scheme. So for those of you who are just painting Leviathan, don't bother with this color. In fact, if you want to, you can also scale back on the pink, the original pink a little bit. Maybe perhaps mixing the original pink with royal purple, maybe a 50-50, so that the highlight is not too stark. So you can kind of see I'm giving it this pinkish color. I kind of like it as well. I don't really have very many pink armies, and this was an opportunity also for me to have something that's a little bit more in this scheme. So spraying in between. Again, if it's not super tidy, it's totally fine. Either way, we're going to be going over it with a brush very shortly to further boost the contrast. Alright, so with that, let's move back to the claws and the weapons. So in this case, I'm going to be using just Bloody Red, and I'm just going to be using it to highlight the weapons as well as the claws as well as the talons. So airbrush. For the small little like thumb claws as well as the small little spurs on the back of the leg, I actually just used the normal brush. I did not airbrush those because that would be a little bit difficult. I have to mask it. I didn't want to do that. Now moving on to the blues, I'm using a combination of turquoise, temple guard blue, as well as Baharoth blue. So starting with the turquoise, I paint all the areas that I want in the turquoise with, well, the turquoise first for starters. It's a very nice, very rich, very opaque color. This is even with me thinning it down, you can kind of see that it almost covers in a single layer. So I'm doing 2 thin coats in this case, followed up by the temple guard blue. So again, wherever I think that the light is going to hit, I use temple guard blue. And then I follow this up with Baharoth blue as well. Now for all of these ridges, I do paint them individually, and you'll see on the gun, you can see all of those small little strips. I did also paint all of those one by one. If you wanted to save a little bit of time, it is possible, of course, to perhaps paint them with an off-white and then just drown it in, for example, athematic blue cotton paint. That will work as well. Or just, wash it with a turquoise ink. That will work as well. But in my case, I kind of wanted the control of doing it by myself. So there you go. That's the blues in place. Now later on, I also figured that the eyes were a little bit too blue, so I actually put a little bit of black on the upper corners of it to further improve the contrast. Now we're going to continue with the whites. In this case, I'm going back to a brush to increase the contrast. I'm going back with tonwood green. So I'm just painting in all of the recesses. Some of you may be thinking to yourselves, well, Professor, didn't you already undershade it? But I realized that when you do it that way, the tonwood green, of course, it's very thin, right? I didn't use too many layers. I didn't want the underparts to be too dark. So when you paint the tonwood green directly into the recesses, it actually gives a much stronger contrast. And also, if you started with the undershade and you built up all those layers, some of that shading is definitely going to get lost in the airbrushing. So I've just kind of restored the color with this. So anywhere that should have shadows, that should have a shade, I basically paint tonwood green with a brush. So there you go. Now, if you were painting an entire army and you wanted to kind of finish these very quickly, you could honestly just stop here, right? I think the model looks fairly decent. Maybe focus on the face a little bit more. But of course, I'm going to go a little bit further. I'm going to add some pure white into the mix. So the pure white is going to be used for the extreme highlights. As you can kind of see, it doesn't really pick up very well on the camera, unfortunately. I actually use this, I don't paint straight lines with it necessarily, but I just paint the areas which catch the most light. So you can see on top of the ridges, at the parts where there are rounded edges facing the light. And you can see, in a darker light, this is why I purposely toned down my light, so you can kind of see the difference between the areas that were highlighted with the white versus the original color, and this is where we get the maximum contrast. Now continuing with the reds for, the entire model, a combination of those colors were used for the highlights. So in this case, I am just doing some edge highlighting, typical edge highlighting in this case. I'm using the same colors for both the talons and the weapon. So weapon will end up a little bit more red in real life, whereas the talons will have a little bit more purple in real life. The distinction is not very obvious, but it's kind of there. So working in all the edge highlights, as you can clearly see. And again, you could have stopped here, but I figured that the edges were not bright enough, so I went over all of this with one extra highlight later on. This is the highlight. So in this case, I am just using straight up pale flesh. So only on the edges, and again, you can see that I'm not drawing the entire edge with it, just kind of in broken areas to show a little bit of texture, right? And finally, we're working on the carapace. So I brush painted Negro Night? I think that was the name of the color, but basically this really dark purple into all of the areas, all the shaded areas of the armor blades. So one by one, very mildly time consuming, not really that much because the plates are pretty big anyway. And this really helps bring out the definition between all of the armor blades. It's also a darker color than the royal purple that I used earlier on for the original base coat. And then here I'm using just pink. So I'm basically using back the same colors I used earlier on, right? So in this case, I'm using Vallejo pink and painting on this stripe pattern. Now, stripe pattern can be as thin or as broad as you want. I kind of like it thinner. I've seen some very nice paint jobs with thicker strokes. It's entirely up to you. So I'm just adding all of these small little strokes. Again, it's kind of for texture. Just flick, flick, flick. We don't want to necessarily spend too much time doing this at army level, and some of you may actually just decide to skip it entirely. Now, to further highlight this, I used a little bit more pale flesh. In this case, I used a small brush to only pin out kind of the edges. You can notice how I start from the very tips of the edges and I highlight there. I don't re-highlight the entirety of the pink stroke with this pale flesh. And you'll see that at the end of the day, this is going to be the end product. A lot of the paints that were used were kept consistent, right? You'll see that even the purple has some pale flesh in it, even the reds have a little bit of the flesh in it. It kind of adds to a coherency and consistency throughout the model. So I hope that this video has helped all of you. Please do consider subscribing as well as checking out my other social media links down below. Thank you and take care.